on Auschwitz. The history of Auschwitz is exceptionally complex. It combined two functions, a concentration camp and extermination center. Nazi Germany persecuted various groups of people there, and the camp complex was continually expanded and transformed. In the podcast on Auschwitz, we discuss the details of the history of the camp, as well as our contemporary memory of this important and special place. You have arrived not to a sanatorium, but at a German concentration camp in which the only way out is through the chimney. If someone doesn't like this, he may at once go to the wires. If there are any Jews in this transport, they have no right to live longer than 2 weeks. If there are any priests, they may live for a month, the rest only 3 months. This is how the speech given by Auschwitz camp manager Karl Fritsch was recalled by Jan Karcz in his memoirs. Teresa von der Ciche of the Museum Research Center talks about the first moment at Auschwitz, when deportees came into the contact with the world of death, terror and dehumanization, as well as the factors that could help surviving the camp. How did the survivors describe their first encounter with the reality of the camp?
The prisoners deported to Auschwitz camp start their stories usually with something what happened before, what led them to be sent to concentration camp. And that was the arrest, if we consider the first prisoners deported to Auschwitz, the staying in prison, interrogation, which was harsh, brutal, humiliating. In terms of Jewish prisoners, that was staying in detention camps. For some of them it was a longer period, few days, maybe over a week. For some of them it was shorter staying, depending on how the transport was announced and organized. Then, if we consider Sinti and Roma, who were also deported to the camp with the whole families, before deportation they were gathered in formal detention camp. And again, the treatment wasn't very harsh, but the fact of being separated behind the wires was hard for them, was difficult. They didn't really understood in what situation they are. They were not much explained. Again, different situation led Soviet prisoners of war to the camp. They were captured during combat, and they were first in the camps for prisoners of war, many of them in extremely harsh conditions and being treated very badly by the German supervisors of this camp. And especially those who were coming through very difficult, harsh, brutal, abusing situation, they were saying that it was kind of introduction for what they are going to face in the camp. Of course, saying about it, they were having the perspective of their whole story, of the whole camp life, but they were stressing the fact that at that very point, they were in a really hard and difficult mental state.
What was the first experience of a person entering the concentration camp?
Taking into consideration the timeline, so the different groups deported to Auschwitz, we find in the testimonies, in the memoirs, information about the speech. Prisoners of the first transport, the Polish prisoners, are saying about words directed to them, usually by some SS officer. The first who started the speech was the camp leader Karl Fritsch, and he was to say, you came here to concentration camp, not to a spa, and you are to work here. If you don't like it, you can go on the wire. And then he was mentioning 3 groups. If there are some Jews among you, you may stay here 2 weeks. Priests, 3 weeks. The rest, 2 months. More or less these periods. But these 3 groups, they were mentioned. And as they are honestly saying, at the beginning they couldn't really figure out much of what these words were meaning. what it means to go on the wire, why just this three specific group. But then the next procedure they have to go through, like the disinfection in icy water or boiling hot, being pushed, being beaten, being abused constantly for any slight action which was not correct according to the German SS soldiers or the functionary prisoners. So that was their first view of the camp, that they are not a person having name, surname, they are numbers. Numbers they got during this registration procedure. The Jewish prisoners deported to Auschwitz, they remember something they were really surprised with and didn't know the value at the beginning. That was the selection. The moment that they were separated from their relatives, men on one side of the unloading platform, women on the opposite side of the platform. And in some testimonies we find information that, especially those who were fluent in German, they started to ask the soldiers on the platform about what is going on, just the questions relating to the situation. And they remember the soldiers answering the question in a proper way. In some testimonies we find information about people being forced to be separated, about screaming, about shots, well, not directed towards people, but to keep some order on the platform, dogs barking. So again, brutal, generally brutal atmosphere. And then the moment about life and death, well, they call it in their testimonies, but in this very situation it was to go to the right or go to the left, to go to the camp, have some chances to survive, or go to the group which was directed to the gas chamber.
The situation of Jewish deportees is indeed different from non-Jews who do not go through the selection. And the moment that is particularly painful here is the moment when they entered the camp after the selection and they realized what actually had happened, what had happened with their children, parents, relatives.
Many of them, actually almost all of them, are saying that that was the first question they were having again after the admission, after the registration, after being given the number. Where are the other people? They were taken somewhere. And sometimes they were asking the other inmates in the barrack especially. One of the survivors is saying that he was told in a very harsh even way by the other prisoner, look at the smoke out of the chimney. Here are your relatives, here are your parents, here are your clothes, here are your children. And they are saying that this moment was devastating for them. They didn't know, of course, what the smoke is, what the chimney is. So the next information, the gas chamber, the crematorium, the selection, mass killing. This information which were thrown on them in a very first contact, they were taking in a very, very hard way. But then they say that looking generally at their camp life, that was the best way to be told this information. In a harsh and very direct way. Just to be told the story from the beginning to the end. Not to wonder, not to dream of maybe they were not, maybe they are somewhere. This is what many of them are stressing. That was extremely painful, extremely hard, but from their perspective, over 70 years perspective of the camp life, that was the best way.
There are also non-Jewish prisoners in the camp when the functions is changing and when extermination begin, that they also started witnessing the process of selection and they had to figure out what the Germans are doing and how the camp is changing.
That was at the beginning of 1942. Of course, the prisoners were not explained. What are the new constructions? Who are the new transports? Even the prisoners who were in the registration, in administration, they simply had to follow instructions. And they were very surprised to have to deal with first new prisoners, different prisoners, people who were not going through prisons, through investigation. And first of all, people from all over occupied Europe. Suddenly they are having the Slovak Jews, later on French Jews, Dutch, and all the other nationalities. So the atmosphere in the camp, the questions in the camp, they have changed because the prisoners had changed.
One of the important part of this first experience, when we also talk about people learning or trying to figure out the strategy of survival, is the encounter with the camp system. Not only barbed wires, not only architecture and buildings, but the hierarchy of the camp. On one hand, the SS men, on the other hand, the functionary prisoners. They needed to learn what it means and who is capable of what and who is responsible for what in a very short time.
There are people who were having a really great impact on the surviving strategy, SS and functionary prisoners. They were actually all trained on different stages how to make the camp as the organism, as the institution, in unbelievable terror. Of course, not in the paper. If we take the documentation from Dachau, the documentation relating to how the SS guards are to be prepared for the service in concentration camp, is actually nothing wrong, very proper, very correct. But there was something else which was constantly added to each point, which was the brutality, which was not punished, which was accepted. Even the SS guards were supported to be brutal. In some opinions of the SS guards which survived, we may read descriptions that they are too weak, they were too mild, they were not behaving as they were towards the prisoners. The other group, which in fact was having very close contact with the prisoners, were the functionary prisoners. They were also prisoners, but they were chosen. The first functionaries were German criminals, people of different criminal pasts. Some of them were really dangerous people. Some of them, they were committing some minor, let's say, crime, and this is why they ended up in concentration camps. But again, being selected, being sent from Sachsenhausen to Auschwitz, that was their job, to build the structure, to build the system, to introduce the brutality, the terror, and the fear, constant fear and unknown future for the prisoners. They never knew what to expect the next day, and that was their job to do. Not only the German prisoners, later on as the camp was growing and more prisoners were sent for the camp, they were looking, the SS guards, they were looking from among the prisoners those who were showing the sadistic behaviors, and they were given this post.
Can we see a difference when we look at the testimonies, especially about this first impression and entering the world of the camp, the difference between the testimonies of men and women?
In the testimonies we are having, which are available from men and women, there are many differences in terms of entering the camp and also the strategy of surviving the camp. I would like to mention one which is not so often marked. It's the relation to family, especially the family who stayed at home, stayed outside the camp, as they were saying. In the testimonies or literature by a man, very often this is not some information they introduce in the first pages or the first sentences of their stories. Usually it's just what happened to them, like the sequence of events. And then when they are asked, if we talk about the testimonies, they are saying about how much thinking about the family, connection with the family by the letters, camp letters, was important for them. How often they were missing them, for example, seeing the families on the unloading platform, the Jewish families. Again, the association with their own children, relatives, was coming in immediate way. In terms of women, this information is coming faster, especially the mothers who left their children at home, or those who were having some closer relatives left, and they were very close to them.
One of the differences I noticed when I was listening to stories of men and women, when we talk about the beginning, was also the process of registration, especially inside the sauna buildings when they were shaved and stripped and washed. Men do not really spend so much time talking about this process. For women, the humiliation of nudity, of some remarks given by either the functionaries or the SS, the fact that they had to be naked among their families or strangers, was very powerful, and here we also see this difference.
The registration disinfection for women was very hard. And what's interesting, actually, for all the groups which were registered here in Auschwitz or in Birkenau, the Polish women are saying about the shock that they are to be naked, they are to be shaved by strangers, by men. All parts of the body were shaved. So again, very intimate and humiliating moment. Then very shortly, the Jewish prisoners, the Jewish women which were brought here, many of them were from Orthodox families, when again the traditions of body, of undressing, were very, very clear, and suddenly the young women were to undress in front of non-Jewish, strange men. It was extremely hard for them, painful, shocking. They, for several hours or even days, were hardly coping with this shocking situation. And the same reaction was for the Roma people. Again, they were more into their own group. They were kept separately in the family camp, but again, they have to go through this procedure. So having the other, well, they were Roma people, but they were not relatives. They were from different families. So for them, the nudity and being naked was also very, very difficult and humiliating moment.
Prisoners had to struggle in the camp day by day. And of course, when we talk about the daily life in the camp, we have horrible conditions of life, starvation, violence, fear, slave labor. But also what is important when we talk about the survival chances or survival strategies, on one hand, we have a day which is very structured from morning till the evening. On the other hand, the absolute unpredictability of what is going to happen, what the Germans or the functionaries are going to do. It made the thinking of how to survive much more difficult.
Actually, each moment of their camp life could bring some situation which was leading to death, basically. The morning routine, the using of the sanitary facilities. If something happened, again, the punishment was immediate. Beating, the wounds appeared, wounds which were not healed, dirty, infection, and just that was the straight way to death. Then food, officially they were to be given 3 times per day some portions of food. But that was not enough for people working so hard from morning till night. And again, because of some events, they were refused a soup, of a portion of bread. So again, their physical condition was just going lower and lower. Work in the camp was absolutely the element of extermination. It has got very integral part of having the strategy to survive or not having any strategies at all. What was bringing the strategies? Qualification, the job, something what they have learned before deportation to the camp. Camp needed mechanics, electricians, builders, also strong, healthy men for all the building work, carrying the material and doing all kinds of very difficult building work. But those who could have a specific work, mechanics, car mechanics, SS was having here vehicles. So to take care of them, to fix them, to do all the service, that was the job of the prisoner. Job under the roof, job with better portions, job with more access for sanitation. So the qualification was having very, very important role. Then the place they were accommodated, the buildings, if they were in Auschwitz I, so the red brick, a little bit better structured, with functionary prisoner who was a better person, as the survivors are saying, some of them were better humans. So having these people around them again was bringing much more chances to survive. In Birkenau, the conditions also affected strategy to survive. The epidemics which were spreading were extremely difficult to avoid, because that was just the disease which was spread from prisoner to prisoner. So that was a combination of many, many circumstances.
There are different reactions of people to this reality, but can we see that there is a moment when people simply become numb, that they stop reacting, and how could they build these connections with life to avoid that kind of numbness that again could lead very quickly to deterioration and death?
The survivors are saying that if they did not recover, let's say it, from the first shock, they started to react in a very indifferent way to anything what was around. Sometimes they thought, well, that's the strategy, to isolate, completely isolate from this reality. But very often it led to not eating in the camp. They say the food was horrible. It was horrible in terms of taste or quality or the ingredients with minimum calories, but they had to eat something. If they stopped eating, they started to be just completely absent from the surrounding world. And they say they needed very often a person around to shake the other. There is a story which is remembered and repeated very often of two prisoners in the washroom in Birkenau, and one of the prisoners was washing himself. There was a water finally in the tubs, so he was having just the proper morning sanitation. And the other prisoner was watching him in awe and asking, why are you doing this? They don't want us to be clean, to be washed, to use these facilities. They treat us as slave labor and no interest in our condition. And his reply was that they all know it because they've been in the camp long enough to realize what is the relation. But this is something important for him, to keep the dignity, to keep the morning routine, the way, the system, to gather the thoughts, to gather all his mental abilities for the next part of the day, for the next job, for the next day, for the next week, to keep fighting for surviving the camp. And that was his strategy, just this tiny elements. So they say they needed someone from outside to be helped, basically, that they have to fight.
What could be those little things that could help people fight for their dignity? On one hand, we know that in the camp some people could receive letters, for example, from their family, and that could be a very important element that give you strength to keep fighting. On the other hand, we can see many interactions among prisoners in the camp who are trying to keep some of the aspects of the life from before the camp, and it could also help them to maintain their humanity and their dignity.
Letters were very, very important for the prisoners. They were to write the letters and receive the letters from the family. Of course, everything in the camp form, so with the information, I'm healthy and in a good shape, and some general information, nothing detailed about the camp, about their condition. And the same was for the family, very general letter. But they are saying such information like a sentence that someone had birthday in the family, that something happened in the house or in the town, that they are healthy, the family members are healthy, was such a support for them. And again, in return, they started to use like a code to inform the family about the camp life. Again, they have to be careful because the letters were censored, so they could be stopped very quickly. Then parcels. In autumn 1942, the prisoners were allowed to receive parcels from home.
From the of course.
Yes, the same was with the letters. Only the Polish prisoners or the political prisoners from countries which were under German occupation, they could receive the letters. The Jewish prisoners were not to receive any correspondence or parcels. Also the Soviet soldiers, also the Sinti and Roma prisoners. So they were just this contact which were not available for all the prisoners. But in terms of parcels, they were quite a challenge for the relatives. We need to remember that Poland was under German occupation, German control, so the shortages of all products for all the society, food rations. So to make a parcels with the food which can last for a little bit longer was so difficult. One of the survivors remembered parcels from his parents. He was the only child living in Warsaw, a teenager, member of the resistance movement. So the parents were sending him parcels, and his father was making the box himself, trying that the parcel is not being smashed, is not being ruined. So there was a special system of paper and wooden elements which was to keep the parcel as a whole. Then the products, for example, they were trying to send him something he could spread on the bread, some kind of fat with some pieces of meat. So it was put in the little glass tubes, again protected. Seeing this great care of the relatives was so supportive, was so important, and kept them running, kept them fighting for the next day in the camp.
What about the life of prisoners and their interactions?
The survivors are saying that usually in the camp they were mixed. People, different languages, different religion, different origin. What happened that they started to learn the languages of one another. Of course, not everywhere. Not all the prisoners needed to or wanted to learn some foreign languages. But I remember a survivor from Slovakia, Jewish survivor, and when we met, she started to talk to me in Polish, really nice Polish in terms of grammar, pronunciation. So I asked her, how did you learn the language? And she said, my teachers of Polish were the prisoners from Warsaw. So this is how they learn. They remember also learning French, Hungarian. Then the other element, which was interaction of the prisoner, was something what they were coming to the camp with, like the education and literature. Something what is really surprising when we analyze the camp life. The prisoners sitting in the evening in the barracks and together saying poems they remember from the schools. Even more, those who were talented in poetry, they were making new poetry and teaching the others. So again, some of them remember to the end of their life these poems they were together saying in the camp. Of course, the poems were relating to their lives, sad, but again, for them that was the unity, that was the support. In the camp hospital, for example, where sometimes there were some people connected with education, like professors of universities, professors of literature, of history. So some of the survivors remember in the evening being introduced short lectures about history, about literature. And for them it was again to get the mind, to get the thinking out of this reality, a moment of relief, a moment of being in a different way of thinking. This support was very, very important and remembered by the survivors.
We've already touched upon it a little bit. You were mentioning the work experience of some prisoners that could give them better chances of survival because of what they brought with them from the time before the camp. Are there any other individual features, maybe spiritual, maybe physical, that could help people to struggle and to survive in the camp?
Some survivors say that actually the work, the place they were sent for, was just the first step to survive the camp. If that was a good unit, you may have chance to survive. If you at the beginning were thrown into some cruel situation, little chances to get out of this. And some of them learned that in the very first moment they try to find a place, to fight for the place. For example, carpentry, a work under the roof, as they say, so indoors, and with some material equipment, tables, chairs, wardrobes, some furniture which was essential for the camp existence. So they needed carpenters. And one of the prisoners, he was a journalist, he was a person who could write, but in his life his relative was having a little carpentry, so he at least knew how to handle the tools needed. So when they called for new carpenters, he of course rose his hand that he is a carpenter. He was taken for the kind of test exam, and it was clear that his skills are very limited, but somehow, because of a good functionary prisoner, he was accepted for this commando, and he did his best. He was learning very quickly how to help, how to be helpful for the carpenters, real carpenters, to stay in this unit, because that was his way to survive. The survivors are saying the longer they manage to stay in the camp, they have to learn very quickly the new skills, the new elements. Even the slightest idea of some work could save them. In terms of women, the situation was much complicated, because many of them, as the social, the cultural view of women at the beginning of 20th century, as we talk about the society at the beginning of 20th century, was for the women to take care of the family, to be tied with the housework. So not many of them were having a job, real profession. So this is why the employment for them was limited. So as long as they learned how to deal with office work, with keeping some documentation in terms of the registration, that was again a chance for them to survive. Another element which also get very important role for survive was the religion, and again the tradition they were having due to religion. As they say, prayer, something what they did most of their life. They started the day with a few words, a few sentences of prayer, or in a moment of some difficulties, again they directed their thinking and their emotion to some religion, what brought them relief. They could not save them for the difficult situation, but the emotions were calmed. And then also some links were established because of religion. The prisoners were looking for the chances to pray together, and actually all religions, the Christians, Jewish prisoners, again they were gathering together to have the moment of praying together. So they were looking for a company, for some people around them, and it again in a tiny but very emotional way supported the prisoners. Another thing also remembered by the prisoner was thing which related to their past was, for example, the physical activity like sport. Many of the sport people, some of them even the champions, Olympic champions, were sent for the camp, and to try to keep the physical exercises daily not to lose their condition, their strength, help them. Maybe not in a way that they could be champions again, but it was just like a rhythm, like a routine, something what kept them out of the camp reality and their way to survive. Many of the prisoners were sent for the camp also because of their political views, of their activity in organizations. So naturally in the camp they could find some people of the same views and talking, being around them. This is how the resistance movement in the camp was also organized in a very active way, helping the other, sending the message outside, build some links among them. That was another very important part of the camp reality and the surviving the camp reality.
I think we need to remember that in the reality of a concentration camp, prisoners in fact did not have much control over their survival. We need to remember that this is the world that is supervised by the SS, by the functionaries, and this unpredictability that we mentioned was very important. So a lot of the survival depended on luck.
I remember once talking to a survivor, and because we knew each other for quite a time, so this question was easier for me to ask. The question, in her opinion, why she managed to survive. I say this because that was very difficult to ask many of the survivors. So this kind of closer relation helped. And she was saying, I wasn't the strongest. She was a teenager when she was taken for the camp, and physically she was rather a small person. I wasn't the wisest. Again, not much education, but I managed to survive. I was basically lucky. This is what she considered her survivor. I was basically lucky. Having around her women of a more physical or intellectual chances to be found somewhere, to be sent for some work, and they were gone, they were disappearing shortly because of diseases, because something happened in the unit they worked and the whole unit was terribly punished, what led them to death. And also the evacuation, which was marching for kilometers, was so difficult for the prisoners. So seeing that many people around her who were gone so quickly, that was her opinion. Not only her, many other prisoners were saying. Some of them are saying that it was actually a combination of luck and the circumstances, the people you've got around you. As the survivors are saying, I wasn't the wisest, so she could not realize the situation, could not judge the situation in a proper way. But there was someone next to her, friendly, who was helping, who was just pushing her into this particular unit or this part of the barrack to stay, and it helped. That was the chance for her, for him.
This is, I think, something we need to realize, that when we talk about an individual person and their time in the camp, there are so many factors that we need to take into consideration when we look at the person's struggle in this world, that basically having them all together means that they had luck in this sense.
They had luck in this sense, but each luck was having kind of story which brought them, which led them to the fact that they managed to survive.
All episodes of the On Auschwitz podcast are available at auschwitz.org/podcasts. We kindly ask you to support our mission and share our podcast in social media.